Good morning, brothers and sisters. This morning, I would like to share a timeline that I've just put together for myself, but I think many of us can actually gain some benefit out of this. My mind is I think there's a lot of people that work that way. I don't think I'm unique. But my mind works in a way that everything needs to be kind of put down chronologically. It's one of the things that frustrates Lalandi quite a lot because I will hammer on to a point until I found when it exactly happened, because it's important in my memories that I know when happened, where and when and what. So we are on a very auspicious day today because today marks the 6th day before the crucifixion of Jesus, if we now go back to then. This coming Friday, we're going to celebrate Easter Friday or Good Friday, and then we're going to have our Easter weekend as we would every other year. But I thought maybe this year I can make it a little bit different for all of us and have this timeline so that when we go now from today onwards, that we can kind of meditate, because Easter weekend is a very important weekend for us. Now, we call it the Easter weekend, but it's actually the Passover. So it's got great importance because, yes, Jesus did die, but it's also when God brought the Israelites out of Egypt and all of the miracles that are happening there, and what it actually symbolizes for us still today of how God can remove a nation out of sin into a promised land, which is ultimately a prophecy of how God is going to take his people and give finally the promise to Abraham of a perfect world. So, and then on the more important side, we have Jesus that was born and showed us how to live, and then ultimately dying for all of our iniquities on the cross. So it's a uberly important weekend for us as followers of Christ. So I would just like to have this timeline so that we can kind of have that in our minds, and we can use that as a form of meditation of the life of Jesus before he had to suffer on our behalf. Now, a few things that I kind of need to highlight before I start is I'm going to use Hebrew time logic. So if you're going to work on 24-hour days, starting from midnight to midnight, you're going to be super confused with what I'm doing. Hebrew days start from sunset to sunset. So in other words, tonight will be the start of Monday for Hebrews. All right. So just keep that in mind. So there is going to be events that I'm going to mention that logically sound like they should actually be the next day, or the previous day, but it actually is part of the same day. So without further delay, I've used 10 minutes already just to explain what I'm going to do. So let me start doing it. We're going to start on Sunday, which is the first of the 6 days. And this is actually a very significant event that happens. Now, we think, okay, there's not a lot going to happen on the Sunday. And in all fairness, you're right. But one of the important events that kind of does happen is on the Saturday evening, the end of the Sabbath, Jesus is at the house of Simon with Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. And we have this beautiful scene where Jesus is sitting with his disciples and he is busy teaching everyone that's in the room. And the next moment, here comes Mary Magdalene, and she starts to anoint Jesus with perfume and oil. So Jesus is then anointed in Simon's house in Bethany according to John chapter 12, from verse 1 to 8. I'm not going to read every single passage. I'm more just going to put this out in broad terms, and then there's going to be one or two pieces that I might just pick out and highlight for you. All right, so we start off the 6 days, and this is, if you read John, let's just quickly page to John. I especially did not put my verses in today so that we can maybe pick up our Bibles and page to the specific pages. So while I'm talking, I'm quickly paging over to John and reading from the NIV. It says here, 6 days before the Passover. Okay, so there's our evidence already. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrived at Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here, a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. So we already get the idea. It's dinner, so it's a night. Then Mary took out a pint of pure nard, expensive perfume, and poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of perfume. Okay, and then obviously she gets ridiculed. And then Jesus comes to the end where he says, leave her alone. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. So Jesus is now going one step further in that whole conversation and telling them that the day is nigh. We are here. Okay. All right. So that was our first evidence into what the first events would be for these 6 days. So now Jesus has been anointed. Okay. Now, the whole idea behind anointing a person means that he's either going to be anointed as a king, refer back to the book of 1 Samuel, where Samuel goes and anoints Saul's head, and then he goes and anoints David's head, and then it kind of becomes a tradition where every king is anointed after that. All right. And then we also read of how the high priest gets anointed in the book of, I think it's Leviticus. I didn't write that reference down because I wasn't going to make a point of that. But it's important because Jesus is both king and high priest. He is the Melchizedek. All right. So we have now got Jesus at Bethany being anointed. That is the start of all these events. The next event that we have is then the morning of the Sunday. Jesus is going through to Jerusalem, and then he sends out disciples to go and find the colt or the donkey, and they saddle Jesus onto the donkey, and Jesus rides into Jerusalem, and the people are ecstatic because as he comes through, they throw down palm leaves and overcoats, and it is a joyous event. So we've got Palm Sunday, or the triumphal entry, in this recording. All right, and you can use those references from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John for these events. So what is very interesting about this is, if you are a experienced Bible student, then you would know this is a prophecy that was made about Jesus in the book of Zechariah. And I can just quickly page there for the younger people that might not be familiar with this prophecy. But in Zechariah, it says the coming king to Zion. That is the chapter heading. And it says, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. All right. So that is prophecy fulfilled. If Jesus was not anointed that night, he could not ride in as a king into Jerusalem. All right. So two very important events that we need to keep in mind here. But in any case, so now Jesus is riding into Jerusalem, and prophecy is being fulfilled from Zechariah 9, verse 9. Right after that, or before that, it is very hard to say where this event fits in, because if we read Mark, it kind of sounds like it was on the way to Jerusalem before he mounted the colt. Jesus starts to lament over Jerusalem. All right. So he weeps about Jerusalem, saying that you have no idea what is going to happen in these next few days. If you only knew, then you would have appreciated me and appreciated the events that is going to come. All right. So this is very taken with poetical license. If you go and read it, it will read along those lines. But I'm not taking the words verbatim here at the moment. All right. And then Jesus visits the temple. All right. Now, this is only recorded in Mark. In Mark 11, verse 11, it says, and Jesus went to the temple, but because it was too late, he returned back to Bethany. So Jesus goes back to Bethany. He rests up for the night. That concludes day one of Jesus, the 6 days before Jesus's crucifixion. This marks now day two. And so on the Monday, Jesus and the 12 leaves from Bethany. Mark 11, verse 12 mentions this specifically. It says, in the morning, they left for Bethany for Jerusalem from Bethany. And then we have this scene where Jesus arrives at the fig tree, and of course he is hungry, and the fig tree does not bear fruit, and then he curses that fig tree. Now, Brother Lucas has done a wonderful exhortation and Bible study with regards to the fig tree and why all of these events have happened. I'm not going to dive into that, but it is important to know that this happened then on the Monday. Jesus curses the fig tree. Now he goes into the temple, and probably what has happened the day before, he saw these things happening in the temple, and now they're still going on. Jesus throws everybody out in a righteous anger, calling them out for turning a house of prayer into a den of thieves, and basically making everyone aware that what they are doing is wrong. So Jesus chases all of the money exchangers out, and you can find that in Mark 11, Matthew 21, and Luke 19. And then after that, Jesus starts to teach at the temple. And you can kind of copy and paste this event over the next 5 days, because Luke says in chapter 19 that Jesus was teaching at the temple every day. So after that, Jesus returns to Bethany again, according to Matthew 21, verse 17. And that concludes the events that happened on that Monday. Day 3, the Tuesday morning, they return to Jerusalem. And as they come back to Jerusalem, they found the fig tree dead. And Jesus teaches a lesson to all of his disciples, all with regards to faith and prayer. Okay, this is now according to Mark 11, verses 20 to 26. And then Jesus returns to the temple, like Luke says. He went every day to the temple after that to go and teach. And as he's sitting in the temple, his authority gets challenged by the Pharisees and the Sadducees and by the Herodians on taxes, okay? And then they continue with, they don't just challenge him on taxes, but they challenge his authority, what his principles are on the taxes, what his thoughts are about resurrection. This is where that great conversation comes from, where the Sadducees comes in and say, but okay, if you say there's resurrection, then what happens if a wife's husband dies and she remarries, and that husband dies and then she remarries, and several times over, And then finally, she's now resurrected. To who is she actually married? Okay. So this is where that conversation happens. So, and then Jesus also reminds the crowds there of the greatest commandment. So the whole day he is interacting with these Pharisees and Sadducees and Herodians, but then also he teaches everyone else. So he gives us the parable of the prodigal son, of the wicked tenant that kills the farmer owner's son, of the wedding feast, and then basically pointing out to Israel's rejection of God's messengers. So he is fully engaging with all of the people there, teaching the whole day, and then he delivers the 7 woes to the Pharisees at that point, because they were absolutely blind. We can actually go through the 7 woes just for context. Let me just quickly get to Matthew chapter 23. All right, now listen carefully to what Jesus tells the Pharisees here, because I did a Bible class on the Pharisees, so maybe we should keep this in the back of our mind as well. It says, then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must obey them and do everything they tell you. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy loads and put them on men's shoulders. But they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for men to see. They make their phylacteries wide and their tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted in the marketplaces and have men call them rabbi. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you only have one master, and you are all brothers. And you do not call anyone on earth Father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor are you to be called teacher, for you have one teacher, the Christ. The greatest among you will be your servant. For whoever exalts themselves will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Woe to you, teachers of the Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut down the kingdom of heaven in men's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. And then he continues to say, woe to you, teachers of the law, Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel the land and the sea to win a single convert. And when it becomes one, you make him twice as much. You make him twice as much on son of hell as you are. Woe to you, blind guides! For you say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by an oath. So Jesus goes on to call out all of these misdeeds of the Pharisees. It's the whole 30 extra verses. I'm not going to go through all of them, but please do go and read them in your own time, because it's worth seeing all of the things that Jesus puts out and how it's actually a warning, not just to the scribes and the Pharisees, but how it actually applies to us in our own lives as well, where it actually tells us that, if you're going to preach it, practice it, or actually show people what you preach by practicing it. All right. So obviously then all of these scriptures come from Matthew 21, but it's not just in Matthew 21. You're going to have to bounce around from Matthew 21 all the way through to Matthew 25, verse 46. And then same with Mark 11 to 13, and then Luke 20, chapter 20 and 21. That's why I don't have everything listed here, because it's a whole lot of chapters to go through. But these are the key events of what is happening there. Now, day 3 is quite a very interesting one. There's not a lot said about it. But if you now take, Jesus was the whole day, Tuesday, busy talking in the temple. And after this, Jesus actually goes through to the Mount of Olives. And there he depicts the destruction of his body, the temple. Okay, he says that the building will be broken down and not a single brick will remain, but then in 3 days it will be resurrected. And then, of course, all the scribes and the Pharisees are very lyrical about this. So that evening, the start of Wednesday, Jesus is now on the Mount of Olives, and he gives what is called the Olivet Discourse. And in this, he predicts the destruction of the temple. Like I said, this is now on the way already, but he carries on about it. Then he highlights also the signs of the end of the age. So we can take this as a lot of prophecy that happens on this discourse of his. And he continues all into prophecy with the abomination of desolation, which refers back to the book of Daniel. And then he predicts, or not predicts, he foretells his own return later on. But he reminds us that we do not know when this happens. And because of the events that has happened of the fig tree dying and of them now seeing the dead fig tree, he delivers then lessons that was derived from the fig tree. And he continues to urge people then for readiness and faithfulness in several parables after that. Among those are then the parables of the talents of the virgin. So what we gather here is Jesus spent that whole day 3 and day 4 teaching non-stop until the very early morning hours of the Wednesday now. And then not much after that happens. But we read that after that, we see Judas breaking away from the disciples and Jesus, and he starts to plot Jesus' death with the Sanhedrin. That marks day 4. Day 5, again, not much is said about it, but Jesus sends Peter and John to go and prepare for the Passover. So we can gather that this is not just a mere feast. You know, it's not you running to Woolies, going pick up a couple of chickens and a stew, and there you go. They went to the house. They prepared the upper room. They made sure that the meal is cooked, that the bread is available, that there is space and seating for everyone, because it's not just Jesus and the 12, it's Jesus and everyone that's with him. Although we just highlight the part where Jesus is sitting with the 12, there were others among them as well. So the whole day was spent in preparation for the feast. Now comes the Last Supper, the start of Friday. And at the Last Supper, Jesus washes his disciples' feet. In John 13, we see that happening. His last, I don't want to say hurrah, but his last thing that he actually can do physically for his disciples, teaching them this intimate lesson of how they should serve. He continues to identify his betrayer, which is Judas, and he institutes then the Last Supper, which we will be taking part of today as well, where he symbolizes bread to be his body and wine to be his blood. He predicts then Peter's denial, and then he gives his farewell discourse, which includes then the high priestly prayer in John chapter 17. And then from there on, he and the disciples go to the Garden of Gethsemane, where we know Jesus wanted to go to pray for the last time before he gets delivered into the hands of the Pharisees. So, like I said, Judas then arrives and betrays Jesus with a kiss. And then Jesus is then, after that, arrested, and the disciples scatter, but Peter stays and follows close by. All right, so your references for that you can find throughout Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22, and John chapter 13 to 18. Then we read about the trials. Now, keep in mind that most of these things happened in the early morning of that Friday, but they do run out of time because it's not just, okay, now we're going to jump in a Jetta and we're going to drive there. They have to walk. It takes time to get from one place to another, especially when it's a mob and Jesus is tired and all of that. A lot of time goes by. So great events happen here where Jesus is now then tried before Annas and Caiaphas in Sanhedrin. We read this happen still in the morning hours. How do we know this? When Peter denies Jesus, he was standing outside by a fire. All right, so that is one of our clues there, that it's still early morning. It's cold outside. It's not hot yet. Then Jesus taken to Pilate and to Herod and back to Pilate. And then Pilate finds no guilt and he yields to the crowd to have Jesus crucified. Now, I'm not going to go into the crucifixion and into Jesus' burial. I feel that is more relevant for us when we get to the Passover weekend this coming Friday. But these were the last 6 days of Jesus' life. Now, typically when we grab the Bible and we start reading, this all feels a lot like everything happened in one day. But then we realize when we put this out in a timeline, that it wasn't just one long day for Jesus. It was 6 days in which he continued to do his work. Right up to that last moment, he was teaching and praying and full of faith, dedicated to his cause and to his purpose. Yes, we do see a moment of, Jesus asking God to let this cup pass, but he accepts ultimately that this was his designed purpose from the Father, that the perfect lamb should be brought up to the slaughter for the redemption of men. Now, I wish I could say there's one big, huge reveal that can come out of these 6 days, and it probably is. I'm probably just read over it. But it helps us to understand several things, especially in the first day where Jesus is first anointed king and then rising on the colt. Those events needed to happen. And then we also see how Jesus then cleanses the temple so that the temple is a place of teaching again. And then he continues to change it into a house of prayer and continues to teach the people throughout his days up to the last day of his crucifixion. So, brothers and sisters, I hope that this outline and this timeline that I've created for you will help you to meditate in these next few days about Jesus' suffering, about how he continued faithfully in his work and how he did not default from any of his responsibilities. And I hope that this also helps you, if you didn't know any of this before, that it helps you to create this strong relationship with Jesus, and that when we now take part of this bread and this wine, that we can see ourselves in that room with Jesus when he breaks the bread. Amen.